Our story starts in the year 1989, a time when the concept of a handheld console was still a bit new to people. I mean, in general, people had just gotten used to having a console in their homes instead of going to arcades. The NES and SG-1000, Sega's first console, were released in 1983, and in 1993, 4 years after the success of Nintendo's new portable console, Nintendo finally decided to release a Zelda title for it. Link's Awakening, a game that's an enigma and one of the weirdest Zelda titles out there, together with Majora's Mask. It seems like anytime Nintendo decides to make a game outside of Hyrule, you're in for something rather wacky, philosophical, or both. The story begins with Link becoming restless after saving Hyrule from Ganondorf, and so he ventures out with a small sailboat to find some sort of purpose. Now he ends up in a storm, and after a rough battle with the forces of nature, he washes up on the shores of an island known as Koholint, a strange place populated with a unique cast of characters and odd monsters, with some of them not even belonging in this franchise. Look at this Goomba-looking dude, clearly lost in a world where he doesn't belong at all. Now, as soon as Link wakes up, he knows immediately that he needs to get out of there. I mean, just look at the place. But before he does this, he has to pick up a sword that washed up on the beach. But when he does this, a mysterious owl appears. He tells him that high on the mountaintops of this island is a gigantic egg, and inside sleeps a whale-like being known as the Windfish, who must be awakened. This is the only way he could leave, because it turns out that the entire island is just a dream, an illusion, fiction, nothing more than that. And so this entire game, Link is going from dungeon to dungeon to collect a number of instruments to awaken the Windfish, all while exploring the island and meeting its quirky inhabitants. Now, I was only able to play this game later on, around the time when I started making videos here on YouTube, and I used a Game Boy like the one you're seeing right here. By the way, I'm actually selling this custom Game Boy over on my Etsy store, together with a bunch of others. So go check them out. They have modern screens, new shells as well as buttons, and some even have a USB-C battery. Anyway, overall this is a solid Zelda title that takes a lot of inspiration from the first Zelda game and the third one, A Link to the Past. So there are multiple little villages, forests, mountains and dungeons that you explore, with all of them being filled with puzzles, traps and monsters. So in many ways, it was your typical Zelda title that was jam-packed with content. I mean, it had 8 dungeons as well as a whole host of secrets, mini-dungeons and side quests. But in some ways, this game was also quite unique, aside from being the first handheld title in the series. Like I said at the beginning, this game was quite weird, and the one thing that makes it stand out is the story. Before the release of this game, Zelda titles usually had stories that followed a quite simple hero's journey. This is a common story template that you probably experienced many times before, and some of the first people who used this template described it as followed. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and decisive victories are won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. This hero's journey is what we have seen in basically every Zelda game up until that point, but in Link's Awakening, Link already went through this hero's journey in A Link to the Past. So for this game, they went with a different kind of story, because this time Link is saving no one, he just wants to leave. But this will have consequences. If he awakens the Windfish, all the inhabitants of the island will essentially die. Their lives will end together with the dream. Everyone on the island has no idea of their situation, but throughout Link's adventure, he becomes more familiar with a lot of people who live there, especially Marin, who has hopes, dreams, and a deep personality. So the story of this game doesn't revolve around an unlikely hero defeating a great evil and saving the world. Instead, it's all about Link exploring a mysterious island with a dark secret, forcing Link to make a decision he doesn't actually want to make. Wake up the Windfish so he can leave the island, but this will also end the lives of all the creatures and people living there, or he stays there to spare the people, but he can never leave. His whole life will be a mere illusion, and the Windfish is forced to remain remain asleep. So what does he do? This is the entire dilemma of the game, which is very different from any of the others that came before. And I gotta say, I love this. The story is rich and has loads of depth. Even the perfect ending has a heartwarming cutscene where you can see that Marin actually achieved her dream of becoming a seagull. But this isn't the only thing that makes this game unique. It was also the first to introduce a musical element, which had a massive effect on the entire franchise. And I have to thank it for that, because otherwise the ocarina might have never played a big role in titles like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Overall, this was a very solid title, and in many ways one of the best games in the entire franchise. Clearly, Nintendo started off with a home run when it comes to handheld Zelda titles, and when they finally released the next title, they went for a bit of a different approach. In 1998, Nintendo released a new version of the Game Boy known as the Color, which had one big new feature. It allowed for colors. The screen was able to show off color, making games look a lot more lively and fresh. Aside from that, the form factor had changed a little bit as well, but overall it is very similar to the original. But let's look at the next Zelda game that came out on the Game Boy in 2001, the Oracle games. Now, when you talk about the Oracle games, you're not just talking about one title, but two. And in many ways, they are very similar to each other, but also completely different. They were released near the end of the system's lifespan. Oracle of Seasons and its counterpart were set to send the Game Boy Color out with a bang. And they succeeded with that mission. These games were jam-packed with unique features that none others had. For example, the two Oracle titles could be linked to form a single linear plot, with an alternate ending, and this would also unlock extra content, such as new items. In a way, it was a bit similar to what the Pokemon games did, but at least the Oracle games had features that made them truly stand apart. Both of the games revolved around one of the Oracles of the Zelda universe, Din, Faeror, and Nehru, who all control certain elements in the game. In both titles, Link is sent to a foreign land where he needs to help out in some way, but in both cases, he's tricked into helping the villain capture the Oracle of Seasons, known as Din, or the Oracle of Ages, known as Nehru. And so he sets out on a mission to save them and restore the world to normal, with Link manipulating either time or the weather to achieve his goal. Now there's one other thing he uses on these adventures: magic rings, which were only seen in these games. They can be found almost anywhere, and add an RPG-like element to the game, because they act as pieces of gear that can enhance base stats like damage, or give Link a new ability, for example preventing him from sliding on frozen floors. It's a neat little mechanic that allows you to tackle almost any situation, and there are even cursed rings that give you a debuff, making the game harder. But the main gimmick of these games is controlling the elements of life, which are great for puzzles. But in the end, both games have a completely different focus, with Seasons being more action and combat oriented, while Ages is all about puzzles. So in many ways, one or the other will fit with your personal preference of Zelda game, because usually people love one or the other, but when you combine them, you get a very well-rounded experience that's also incredibly long. Really, it was perfect in many ways. It builds upon what we saw in Link's Awakening. It has a top-down view, similar sprite art, items, and more, so it heavily leans on that game. But like I said, you can link the games to get the true ending, where you encounter Twin Rova and Ganon. This is a feature that no other game has, and I think it's pretty cool. It makes these two games one gigantic Zelda title, filled with an insane amount of content and one massive overarching story, which is a really cool idea. And originally, they even wanted to release a third game. The Oracle titles were made by Capcom, and it started with a pitch to Shigeru Miyamoto for remaking the original Zelda for the Game Boy Color. Now, if this remake was a success, then they would be allowed to make a completely new Zelda game from scratch. But due to this, many in the team just wanted to make a completely new title right away. And surprisingly enough, Nintendo allowed this. But after a tough time early on in development due to the narrow screen size of the Game Boy and a heavy focus on scenario over gameplay, they went to Miyamoto for guidance. He suggested a Triforce series of games, 3 titles, with each of them representing a piece of the Triforce, as well as a specific gameplay focus. This is why Oracle of Seasons has a lot of combat, and Oracle of Ages loads of puzzles. But in the end, the 3rd game was cancelled due to complexities with the link cable system, so there were only 2. Now my opinions on these games are a bit mixed. I think the ideas behind them are very cool, but they also have their flaws. The idea of 2 titles with their own focus is great, but in my opinion, Ages did a better job at this than Seasons. The combat focus ends up turning into a bit of a mess. Many rooms are loaded to the brim with enemies, and that's kind of it. At some point it feels like a cheap trick. Well, that's how it felt to me at least. So I became a bit bored and frustrated by it. However, Ages does a better job due to the large variety and quality of puzzles found in all the dungeons. So I like Oracle of Ages more, even though I'm a bigger fan of combat than puzzles in almost any game I play. Aside from that, one other feature that I like is the rings. In many ways it feels like the badges we recently saw in Super Mario Bros. Wonder. They allow you to make the game easier or harder, and don't just focus on simple stat upgrades. Some even have crazy effects like turning you into certain enemies. But sadly enough, Nintendo never really added something like this again. Well, unless you count the new weapons and armor from titles like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. So this is something I kinda miss from these older titles. In general, the Oracle games are quite unique, but in the end, I love Link's Awakening more due to its story and better mix of gameplay elements. However, we have one more Zelda title that was released on the Game Boy series, the Minish Cap. After the success of the Game Boy Color, Nintendo made a big step with their next version, the Advance, that was released in 2001. This version was also very different from all the Game Boys that came before. It went for a new form factor while also increasing its power quite a lot. The graphical capabilities of this console are insane compared to what came before, but for some reason Nintendo still didn't go for a backlit screen. This only happened when they released the SP and Micro version of the Advance. Luckily enough, you can mod them nowadays to give them a proper modern screen like the one you see here. But when this console came out, Capcom got another chance to make a Zelda game in cooperation with Nintendo, and this one was their magnum opus. Well, in my opinion at least. The game was released in 2004 and once again uses a top-down view, as well as many other standards that were set by Link's Awakening. However, as soon as you boot this game up, you will notice one thing. Capcom and Nintendo were able to achieve amazing graphical quality. The pixel art seen in this game is the best the franchise has ever achieved. Effects, enemies, settings, and emotions all look amazing in this. And to this very day, I still think this is the best looking 2D Zelda game in the entire franchise. Now, for the first time ever, this title actually takes place in Hyrule instead of some other mysterious land. The game starts off by sharing the story of how Hyrule was saved by the Picori, a race of small creatures that came down from the heavens and gave the people 2 weapons for defeating evil, the Picori Blade and the Light Force, 2 artifacts with immense amounts of power. When the game starts, Link lives with his granddad and visits the Picori festival with his childhood friend, Princess Zelda. When they arrived, they saw the man who won the sword fighting tournament, and he turns out to be evil, using magic to shatter the Picori blade and open the bound chest, which is filled with evil monsters that were defeated long ago. This evil wizard turns out to be Vati, a Picori who stole a magical cap from his master Aslo and turned him into a hat. Now he has only one goal in mind, gaining power. This is why he's after the Light Force, but once he sees that it isn't hidden in this chest, he becomes angry and leaves. But before he does so, he turns Zelda into stone. Now, with the situation looking dire, the king asks Link to go to the Minish Woods to find the Minish, also known as the Picori, so they can reforge the blade. When going there, Link meets Aslo, and they work together to save Hyrule and stop Vati. Overall, it's a rather standard Zelda game plot. An evil individual shows up and wants to gain power to take over the world. Link goes from a normal boy to the hero the world needs, and at some point a quirky companion is added in the mix. But luckily enough, this game has many things that make it unique from any others that came before and after. First of all, the main mechanic of the game. Using Aslo, you can shrink to the size of a Minish, allowing you to explore new areas or interact with that tiny race. This leads to a number of interesting scenarios in the game. For example, a dungeon where you enter as Tiny Link and end up fighting a regular Choo-Choo who has become an enormous challenge to defeat due to its size. Another cool use of this mechanic is seen in Hyrule Castle Town, where you can explore almost every crevice of a building with Minish living in the walls like mice, which leads to some crazy visuals. For example, in the tavern or library. Really, these sections look amazing and allow you to explore the world in a completely different way. It is so unique that it makes this game very memorable overall. And of course, this is also used for puzzles. You switch between big and small quite often to traverse certain areas in the game. Overall, I think it is a very interesting mechanic that leads to some spectacular visuals. Now, aside from that, this game has one other special mechanic, the Kinstones, which are a bit, odd, I would say. These magical medallions are created and hidden around the world by the Minish, and you need to collect them all. But as soon as you find one, you also need to find someone else who has the other half of the medallion. As soon as you achieve this, you will be rewarded in some way. For example, it unlocks a new path, spawns a chest, starts a new side quest, or something else. It allows Link to find new treasure, paths, or side content. In a way, it's really cool, but also a bit weird, because it adds an extra step to exploring or finding certain things in the world. My emotions on this mechanic are a bit mixed. To an extent, it is fun to find these Kinstones, as well as the other halves. And the simple shots you get of places changing and stuff spawning in start off a fun little scavenger hunt. But at some point, all of this also becomes a bit tedious as well. So yeah, overall a good thing, but not perfect. Now, those are all the things that make the Minish Cap truly different from the rest. But there's one thing it does better than all the others: boss fights. The foes you face at the end of a dungeon in the Minish Cap are amazing. All of them look great, and every fight is memorable. Meanwhile, the final fight with Vati is the best 2D boss in the entire franchise, with 3 forms that all challenge you in a different way. So that's another thing I really like about this title. Now, as you can see, the era of Zelda Game Boy games was quite special. Every title had its own flair, set of mechanics, design, and world. Aside from that, we saw the technology evolve alongside of it. So there are massive jumps in complexity and quality with each installment. I got to experience this as a child, and it was quite exciting. Each version of the Game Boy changed everything, and the titles on it followed. Now, years later, I'm still filled with fond memories of these games. Now, I know that I didn't cover 4 Swords, but that game isn't really a fully fleshed out Zelda title, more of an arcade multiplayer game. So that's why I kind of ignored it. I might make a video on that title, as well as other multiplayer Zelda attempts from Nintendo. Could be an interesting topic. Originally, I came up with the idea for this video when I was working on my custom Game Boys, and I don't really have any fond memories of 4 Swords for the Game Boy, because I was never able to play it with friends. Also, don't forget to check out those beauties over on my Etsy store. A link to it can be found in the comments and at the top of the description. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little retrospective video of the old Game Boy titles. And yeah, be sure to check out my Etsy store. I would really appreciate it if you did that. And be sure to leave a like, subscribe so you won't miss any videos, and tell me in the comments down below what you want to see next. Give me some ideas. I might actually do that multiplayer video like I said. It could be interesting. But that's kind of it. Bye! Check out the other vids.